Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing my updated ultimate guide to spells with the level 6 spells, the most powerful spells in the game. A level 6 spell slot is the most important resource that any character has in Baldur's Gate 3. It's capable of single-handedly winning entire encounters or making every encounter for an entire day vastly easier. As the peak of your spellcaster's power level, you want these spells to be earth-shaking in their impact, and fortunately, they are. At this point, you know the drill. We've already talked about the rating system and definitions of the tiers in part 1, so we're just going to get right into it. But before I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Tarantula for the $10 donation, HIX for the €5, Joe Rundle for the $25, and John Bryant and Alexander Spragle for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate your support. Alright, let's talk the most powerful spells in the game. We're going to start with Arcane Gate, which is one of the weirder and more interesting spells in the game. It's a teleport spell. It takes an action to cast and requires your concentration, lasting for up to 10 turns. And it basically lets you link 2 points where people can move freely in between those 2 points without having to spend movement or pass through the intervening area. Those points each have to be within 60 feet of the caster when you cast it, so you can get a maximum distance between 2 gates of 120 feet if you cast them on exactly opposite sides of your spellcaster. So a lot of characters will have more mobility than this by the time you get access to this spell naturally, so a lot of the time you won't actually gain extra distance on the character who's casting it. But for the rest of your party, or in particular for NPC allies, Arcane Gate can give them a lot of free movement. The AI in the game will pass through the Arcane Gate. It's actually kind of cool. They will always take it into account and they'll walk through it. So you can use this to move NPCs around pretty easily. And so you can use this in encounters where you have to have a lot of characters traverse a large distance, and in particular, a lot of non-player characters traverse a large distance in order to allow them to do that. Obviously, the cost is staggeringly high. A 6th level spell slot is an incredible price to pay for just a mobility effect. So you need to be in an encounter where you require a ton of mobility between 2 specific points in order for Arcane Gate to be good, especially if for whatever reason you need to move back and forth between those points, then Arcane Gate can give you some outs. The main downside of this spell is just it's so expensive, it's short range, it takes your concentration, it's a little fiddly to use, and all you get is the ability to move between 2 points, which your player characters will have better sources of that already, because by the time you've gotten to this point, you really should have gotten everybody enough mobility that they don't need this effect. But there's a couple encounters in the game where you need to move NPCs, and Arcane Gate can be good for that. Usually Dimension Door is going to do the same job, but Arcane Gate does work for those encounters as well. And there's also a couple other niche interactions that this spell has, where you can do some kind of weird and tricky things with it. One of those is enemies can use this spell as well, and they'll follow you through the portal. So you can use this to lure enemies through the portal into, say, a locked room or behind bars, and then stop concentrating on the Arcane Gate. You can, move through it, the enemy follows you through, you move back through it, and then stop concentrating to leave them trapped in a room. You can use that combined with damaging effects on the ground in order to kill a lot of enemies, even very dangerous enemies, quite safely. There's also glitches where you can force move enemies through it, though those are obviously exploits, but you can do that in order to get some instant kills on some pretty powerful bosses. Another thing about Arcane Gate that's a weird and funny interaction is that you can move through it an infinite number of times in a turn. It's just a free action, so you can keep moving back and forth. There are some damaging effects that do damage to you every time you enter them. No matter how many times you do that per turn. So you can use Arcane Gate to instantly reduce a character's health to 0. This can actually be useful with Death Ward, which restores your action when your health is reduced to 0. So you can use the combination of Arcane Gate and Death Ward and a damaging effect in order to get infinite actions. Obviously another exploit, but pretty funny that works. There's also some other neat stuff you can do with this. You can hop through as a free action, drop a bunch of explosive barrels next to an enemy, hop back, and then set those barrels off. So that can be a way that you can use Barrelmancy extremely safely. All of these are extremely niche interactions, but they are kind of cool. Anytime you have a mobility option, there's always some fun stuff you can do with it, but obviously Arcane Gate is the most expensive possible way to get this mobility option. At the end of the day, there's one encounter in which I would say Arcane Gate is actively pretty good, and maybe one other in which it's still not bad, but Dimension Door is better. Technically, I'm going to give it C tier because it does have one or two uses, but for the most part, if you forgot that this spell existed, there are plenty of other ways to solve those encounters, so it's a very low C tier. Blade Barrier. Blade Barrier is a cleric damage spell. It's a wall spell, like Wall of Fire, so you draw it in a line, which of course comes with the glitchy targeting that all wall spells have, where you may not be able to get this on as many enemies as you would think you would, because pretty much any intervening terrain blocks it. Enemies inside of the wall take 6d10 slashing damage with a dexterity save for half, so that's an average of 33 damage on 6d10. And like a lot of other damage on the ground effect, it does its damage both when enemies initially enter the wall and at the beginning of their turn. So before they act, they will take 66 damage on average, which can kill some enemies. However, this spell has some problems. Firstly, it's a level 6 damage spell, and 33 damage a turn is not terrible, but for a level 6 spell, you really want a spell that will just instantly win an encounter, and it's not enough damage to do that. And secondly, it has a dexterity save for half. Enemies will typically have very good dexterity saves, and what's worse, Blade Barrier's save DC is completely bugged. It will always have a fixed DC of 15, no matter your spellcaster's save DC, and on subsequent turns, it will have a fixed DC of 3. You heard that right. 3. So enemies will succeed on the saving throw against Blade Barrier and take half damage pretty much 100% of the time. That obviously vastly reduces the impact of this spell, thanks to that bug. Even if the damage wasn't bugged, it still just wouldn't be that impressive, because it's a wall spell, so it's hard to get on enemies, and that much damage for a cleric level 6 spell slot, which are extremely valuable resources, is just not that exciting. But Blade Barrier is unfortunately bugged and doesn't do nearly as much damage as it should, because enemies always succeed on the save. It's also slashing damage, which you can't easily give them vulnerability on or anything like that. So Blade Barrier, thanks to the bugs and already just not being a great spell even if it worked properly, D tier. Chain Lightning. Chain Lightning is a direct damage spell that does 10d8 of lightning damage to the initial target with a dexterity save for half, so that's 45 average damage, and then arcs to up to 3 other creatures within 60 feet of the initial target. That means it'll almost always hit 4 enemies if there's 4 enemies in the encounter. And if you hit 4 wet enemies with Chain Lightning, that 45 average damage gets doubled to 90, so you'll usually get 360 damage on average from a cast of Chain Lightning. That's a lot of damage, and you can end a lot of encounters that way, so the use pattern for Chain Lightning is very simple. You get them wet, then you blast them, and that finishes the encounter. The jokes write themselves. So the upside of Chain Lightning is that it is a huge amount of damage for the spell slot. It's a great damage to spell slot ratio, and you can often just end encounters with it outright. The downside is it's just direct damage, so if you don't kill a huge chunk of the encounter, then you haven't accomplished anything with your 6th level spell slot. The enemies will still just get to take their turns, so you need to make sure that Chain Lightning is doing enough damage to let you easily kill off a big chunk of the encounter in order to reduce the threats. What that means is, similar to Cone of Cold, this spell is best used in multiples, which you can do either by having more than one character capable of casting it, or using Mark a Hesh gear in order to cast this spell, or using abilities that let you refresh your level 6 spell slots. And with multiple casts of Chain Lightning, you're basically guaranteed to instantly end an encounter. Of course, the goal for a level 6 spell is that you shouldn't need to cast it more than once to win one encounter. If you are trying to just win an encounter outright with a 6th level spell, you don't really want to have to spend more than one. So while Chain Lightning is an amazing tool for ending fights, it does require a little bit more in the form of resource burn than some other 6th level spells. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier, because this is an incredible damaging spell, and especially when layered with other AoE burst damage spells, can just end end encounters immediately, but unlike some of the other spells on this list, it won't single-handedly solve the most difficult encounters in the game, though it does still give you a lot of progress towards winning them, so don't get me wrong, this is still a great spell, but a lot of the thing that you'll see people say about this is, well, I cast 4 of them in one fight and win that fight, and any 6th level spell cast 4 times over will win that fight, so what we're looking for S tier spells is one where we only have to cast it once. It's also, of course, worth mentioning that the way that you're going to cast this spell most frequently in most parties is by using the ability to cast it from Mark a Heshkir once per short rest, where it's both more powerful because that version, thanks to a bug, can be twin-spelled by a sorcerer, and also cheaper because it just costs you a short rest cooldown. So when you use this from an item, Chain Lightning is obviously insane, but even if you're spending your 6th level spell slot on it, it's still very good in a lot of fights. Next up, Circle of Death. Circle of Death is an AoE damage spell. It does 8d6 necrotic damage, which is exactly the same damage as Fireball, a 3rd level spell, with a constitution save for half. The difference between Circle of Death and Fireball is that Fireball has a 13-foot radius, and Circle of Death has a 30-foot radius. So this is a massive area of effect on this spell, and you can often hit a lot of creatures with it. It also has to be targeted specifically at a character, so it always has to be centered on a target. You can't place it in between multiple targets, so it can sometimes be harder to place it exactly where you want it, but the giant AoE means this will hit a lot of creatures regardless. However, 8d6 damage for a 6th level spell slot is just terrible. The amount of damage that this spell does is just not worth wasting your 6th level spells on. So unfortunately, Circle of Death, the math on it simply doesn't work out. It's a con save, so enemies will be much more likely to make the saving throw as well. Honestly, even if you're getting Circle of Death for free from the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, is like not often worth using your action on compared to other free casts of upcasted necromancy spells. Circle of Death is kind of a funny spell to exist in Baldur's Gate 3 because in tabletop D&D, this spell isn't really one that players are meant to cast. This spell exists to allow like an evil villain to show how powerful they are by obliterating an entire army with a single spell cast or slaughtering an innocent village to show how evil they are. So this spell really exists more for narrative reasons than mechanical ones, and that's basically reflected in how it translates to the video game, which is it doesn't. You shouldn't cast this spell. D tier just doesn't do enough damage. Create Undead. Create Undead is a summon spell, and it lets you create a heinous mummy. The mummy is a reasonably powerful summon. I would say it's significantly weaker than all of the other summons available with a 6th level spell slot, but summons are still just very powerful, and the Create Undead mummy can still tank damage, do damage, block areas, give you extra actions, and all of the things that summons are just very powerful for doing. It has 93 hit points and 18 armor class, so it will be fairly hard to keep this alive, especially because as an undead, you can't heal it. And it does decent melee damage, and quite good melee damage against frightened enemies. It also comes with the ability to try to frighten an enemy at range, though that has a DC 11 wisdom save, so it's extremely unreliable. Mostly you're using this just as a melee brawler. Overall, having more summons on the field is always powerful, but this is notably weaker than other summons available at this level, and it's unlikely to last you for more than 1 or maybe 2 encounters if you take real care trying to keep it alive, because it can't be healed easily and takes a lot of damage because it has low armor class and just doesn't have that many hit points. So this will give you a pretty strong advantage in 1 or maybe 2 encounters, but doesn't quite fit the criteria of 6th level spells of giving you a big advantage in many encounters or winning 1 outright. For that reason, I'm going to give Create Undead B tier, because while the summon is still pretty useful, it does die easily and just isn't as powerful as other available summons. It is worth noting that this is one of the Warlock's Mystic Arcanum options, which lets them cast a 6th level spell once per day. And for Warlocks, this is probably the best use of their Mystic Arcanum. I personally always take Eyebite because I think Eyebite is really fun, but a summon is very powerful, so Create Undead is always going to be a good choice for them. This spell is also available to cast from a ring, the Crypt Lord's Ring, and there it's very good, because it doesn't cost you something extremely valuable like a 6th level spell slot, because it's just on a cooldown. So when cast from an item or by a warlock, Create Undead is a little bit more powerful, but for characters that have to spend a 6th level spell slot on it and have alternative things to spend it on, it usually is going to be a reasonable way to spend your spell, but there may be better options. B tier for Create Undead. Next up, Disintegrate. This is one of the most iconic spells in Dungeons & Dragons, and to be honest, I'm a little disappointed with how it came out in 5th edition and in Baldur's Gate 3 in particular. It's a direct damage spell that does 10d6 plus 40 force damage, which is 75 damage on average, but with a dexterity save to completely negate the damage, and it only has 30-foot range. So you target one creature within 30 feet, if they make the dex save, nothing happens. If they fail the dex save, they take 75 force damage on average. If this spell works, 75 damage for a 6th level spell slot is okay. It's not great. Compare it to using Chain Lightning on a wet enemy. You get more damage on just a single target, and it also hits 3 other targets. But it's force damage, so enemies will have a hard time resisting it. So Disintegrate does have some usage against enemies that are resistant to a lot of other forms of damage. Force damage, most enemies have no resistance to. The upside of this spell is that it's pretty good direct damage to an enemy, and if you need something dead, this is a way that you can do it. And the downside is that it has a chance of doing literal nothing, which obviously is not what you want with your 6th level spell slot, and even if it works, the amount of damage that you get from it is probably lower than you would get from just casting another 6th level damage spell, because it only targets one enemy, and the damage simply isn't that high compared to the damage of other spells. There is one use for this spell, which is against enemies with really low dexterity saves. Scrolls of Disintegrate are pretty efficient in terms of doing damage, but I just usually would not want to spend my 6th level spell slot on this, even against an enemy with a low dexterity save. You're much better off using a spell like Chain Lightning or Wall of Ice to do damage. So Disintegrate, sadly, the damage output, the extreme range restriction, and the fact that it can simply miss entirely just make this spell not really worth casting using a spell slot. D tier, sadly, for Disintegrate. Eyebite. Eyebite is one of my favorite spells in the game, so I'm going to admit to a little bit of bias when rating this spell. I just think it's really, really fun to use. But of course the question is, how good is Eyebite? Eyebite is a 10-turn long recastable spell, so similar to Call Lightning in that you cast it and then can recast it each turn for 10 turns, and it comes in 3 modes. Each of these modes lets you target an enemy and apply a debuff to them. The modes are Panicked, Sickened, or Asleep. In the Panicked form of Eyebite, enemies have to make a Wisdom save, or for 10 turns, they are Fearful. Now, Fearful is a little bit confusing in Baldur's Gate because Fearful is a different condition from Frightened, Afraid, or Terrified, which are all, or Panicked, all of which are distinct conditions with their own mechanical effect. Fearful is the condition from the level 3 spell Fear, which makes enemies run away and be unable to take actions, and they can't break out of it unless they get completely out of sight of whatever made them afraid, and then also pass another Wisdom save. So it's probably the second most dangerous crowd control effect in the game after Paralyze, because it completely stops enemies from doing anything, and they can't easily break out of it. So any enemy who's not immune to this effect and can fail a Wisdom save, you're going to be able to just remove from a combat. Because these debuffs last for 10 turns when you cast them on an enemy, they'll last for the entirety of even the longest combat in Baldur's Gate 3. A lot of other crowd control effects have had their durations reduced to 3, but Eyebite still lasts for the full 10 turns. The other 2 variants are a little less impactful than Panicked. Eyebite Sickened targets the enemy constitution and gives them disadvantage on their attack rolls and skill checks. Disadvantage on attack rolls is okay, but for a 6th level spell is certainly not going to be that exciting. And then Asleep puts them to sleep. There's no hit point maximum on this effect, so you can put enemies to sleep, but usually Fearful is going to be a better Wisdom save targeting debuff, though if you need them to stay in one place for whatever reason, Asleep is pretty good. The other thing about these debuffs is that they can all stack on the same enemy, so you can apply them all to the same person, or you can spread them out across multiple enemies over turns of combat when you're recasting Eyebite. Like other spells that give you an action to recast it, you can use it multiple times per turn if you're hasted or have other sources of extra action. So the most powerful way to use Eyebite is in combination with a potion of speed or a haste spell to hit 2 enemies every turn, or even more if you have more sources of extra actions with Eyebite, which can very quickly lock down an entire encounter for the entirety of that encounter. So this spell can disable enemies who even are spread out very far from one another because it's 60-foot range for the caster, so you don't have to catch everybody in an AoE or anything, and can give you a tremendous amount of lockdown as long as you can maintain concentration and recast this spell, and that lockdown is almost irresistible and lasts for 10 turns, so it's incredibly potent when you actually land Eyebite on enemies. The question, of course, is it worth it to spend a 6th level spell slot on something that takes multiple turns to activate? And I think it often is with Eyebite, because if you have a haste effect, you'll be able to take 2 enemies out of the fight right away, and then if the fight goes for another turn, you can take 2 more enemies out of the fight. So in some fights, Eyebite will just end them pretty quickly, especially if enemies are moving towards you kind of staggered, and as each enemy gets to you, you could just Eyebite them and take them out of the fight and send them ping-ponging back in the other direction. Is it better enough than other 6th level spells to make it worth casting in a lot of fights? Definitely not. There's a lot of fights where you would prefer to just blow up the whole encounter right away, or where enemies are immune to the effect. But the debuffs that you get from Eyebite are really powerful, so it can be really good, especially for a warlock who has... this is a Mystic Arcanum spell, so it's not competing with other really powerful spells. Eyebite can be really fun. I'm going to give it B tier because it's very powerful, but fairly situational, and of course it's competing with a lot of other really powerful options, but I highly recommend casting Eyebite just because it's so much fun to play around with this spell. Flesh to Stone. Flesh to Stone is an extremely flavorful spell that's a single target disable that turns an enemy into a rock. It takes multiple turns to do this, so you cast it on one enemy within 60 feet, and they get to make a Constitution save against the initial effect of the spell. If they fail the save, they become restrained, meaning attacks against them have advantage, their attacks have disadvantage, and they can't move. So the same as if you hit them with the level 1 spell Entangle. And then each subsequent turn, they have to make another Constitution save. If they fail that save, then the condition progresses through 3 stages, and if they fail 4 con saves in a row, they get turned to stone, which effectively kills them instantly. If they succeed on any one of these saves, then they break out of the effect, and Flesh to Stone effect ends. Now, obviously, in terms of the mechanical effect of this spell, it's more or less completely useless. You're spending a 6th level spell slot to inflict a debuff that you can inflict in an AoE with a 1st level spell, and then if they fail 3 more saves in a row, then it does something, but it still just kills 1 enemy, which you can often do in a single round with a spell like Disintegrate, which is also low rated, or Chain Lightning, which does more damage to other enemies. There is one upside, which is that as long as enemies keep failing the saving throws, it doesn't count as a hostile action, so you don't enter combat, but if they ever succeed on a save, or if they fail all 4 saves and get turned to stone, then it does start a fight. If you want the out of combat not starting a fight effect, Contagion or Bestow Curse is way better. Flesh to Stone, unfortunately, simply doesn't do enough to justify casting it. It is very funny to turn your enemies to stone, but outside of humor value, you shouldn't cast this spell. D tier. Globe of Invulnerability. Globe of Invulnerability creates a 10-foot radius circle on the ground in which all creatures are immune to all damage. Being completely immune to damage might sound broken to you. You can't die if you can't take damage, and you're right, it is broken. You can't die if you can't take damage. Most fights in Baldur's Gate 3 are damage races. The enemies are simply trying to do enough damage to kill you before you do enough damage to kill them. And Globe of Invulnerability outright wins every single one of those encounters. Any encounter where it's just a race between damaging characters, Globe of Invulnerability is your best tool, and that includes most of the most difficult boss fights in the game and lots of other less dangerous fights as well, and this spell will simply outright solve them. It's also incredible in fights where the arena is a threat, where you take damage from the ground or from effects that are going on in the world around you, because Globe of Invulnerability lets you completely ignore those. The vast majority of threats in this game are damage, and Globe of Invulnerability makes you invulnerable to those. It also is extremely synergistic with itself. It's a concentration spell, but the way that you're usually going to lose concentration on a spell is by taking damage, which Globe of Invulnerability makes impossible. There are some ways that enemies can break it. They can still land crowd control effects on you, and so your characters can still get hit by stuff like Hold Person while you're hiding in the Globe of Invulnerability. You need to be careful with that. And if your caster gets knocked prone, they will lose concentration on this spell immediately, which can cause a burst of damage to show up. Enemies can also walk inside the globe and become immune to damage, though usually you can just push them right back out. And in the worst case scenario, you just cancel concentration on the spell, and then you get a full turn of damaging them while they had to waste their turn not hurting you. It's very hard to put into words just how powerful this spell is. There's most encounters in the game, Globe of Invulnerability simply wins outright. 3 turns where you get to do whatever you want and the enemies can't do anything is more than enough to win every fight in the game, and that's what this spell does. This is probably the single most important resource in the game to have for most boss fights. A cast of Globe of Invulnerability is a thing that you should try to get in every honor mode party. It's just that powerful. You can use scrolls of this if you don't have a sorcerer or wizard to cast it, and collecting these scrolls is very important to keeping your party members alive. If you want a more challenging version of the game, not casting this spell is one of the best ways to increase the challenge level of Baldur's Gate 3. It's just that powerful. S tier for Globe of Invulnerability. Harm. Harm is a single target direct damage spell, 60-foot range, and it does 14d6 necrotic damage with a constitution save for half. 14d6 is 49 average damage, so very low for a 6th level spell and only to one target. And it has a constitution save, the worst save to target, to take half damage. If the enemy fails the save, it also actually reduces their max health instead of doing damage, so it will actually reduce enemy maximum health. But because it doesn't technically do damage to them, you don't get any of the damage modifiers that you would have potentially if it was a damaging spell. If they succeed on the save, then you do get those damage modifiers, so it works a little bit weirdly. Already, this is not good. It's an unreliable, very low damage, direct damage spell, which obviously is not what you want, but the spell gets significantly worse. It cannot reduce an enemy below 1 hit point. That's right, this is a damage spell that cannot kill an enemy. Damage spell that can't kill an enemy, I mean, come on, do I really need to say any more than that? Just an embarrassment of a spell. D tier. Heal. Heal is a healing spell that heals an ally for 70 hit points. This is, of course, the most powerful and sort of ultimate healing spell in Baldur's Gate 3, but healing, especially high numerical healing in Baldur's Gate, is typically a fairly weak strategy because it's reactive rather than proactive. It's better to kill or disable the enemy before they do that damage than it is to heal it back up after it's already been dealt. That being said, 70 healing is a lot of healing. This also removes blindness, which might come up in some scenarios, and diseases, which usually won't come up. But 70 healing is enough to get most characters back to full health after most incoming damage. Obviously, if you're a really high health character, like a barbarian, then the 70 healing might not quite top you up. But for most characters, after a turn of enemy attacks, heal's going to be a full heal. It costs your 6th level spell slot, though, and that's such a tremendous cost for something that's just purely reactive and lower impact than just removing enemies from the fight. This is a cleric or druid spell, so it's competing with lots of ways to prevent this damage from happening in the first place. The fact that it does full heal your party member means it's probably not 0% that if you had this spell prepared, it would be right to cast it. But I think it basically is 0% that it's right to prepare this spell compared to doing anything else that will prevent this damage from happening in the first place. So even on a dedicated healing character, I don't recommend spending your 6th level spell slot on this. prevention, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and nowhere is that more true than in Baldur's Gate, and heal is kind of the epitome of that aphorism. You also, of course, have to bear in mind that this is just competing with drinking high-level healing potions, which by the time you get this spell, you should be absolutely swimming in. You should have enough to open your own pharmacy. So heal is usually just not going to be particularly relevant, and you should rarely have this spell prepared. D tier for heal. Next up, Hero's Feast. Hero's Feast is a day-long, non-concentration buff that buffs your entire party, including any summons or familiars or anything that you might have. So you can get often many, many creatures in the radius of this spell, and it will buff all of them. And it gives your party members the Thoroughly Stuffed condition, which I'm sure is a name we can all be very mature about in the comments below. While your party is thoroughly stuffed, they have plus 12 to their maximum hit points, and that works the same as the extra max HP from Aid, in that it's real max HP that you can heal back. It's not temp HP that is unhealable, and it stacks with the extra max HP from Aid. So with a high-level Aid and a cast of Hero's Feast, your party can easily have in excess of 30 extra health on every party member and every summon. In addition to the extra max HP, they are immune to diseases, poisons, and the frightened condition. And in addition to the frightened condition, it also makes you immune to a bunch of other kinds of fear effects. There's lots of different things that use some form of fear, and Hero's Feast makes you immune to most of them. And you also make all of your wisdom saves with advantage. This is a really powerful stack of buffs. The extra HP is obviously great, and we talked about why that is with Aid, and Hero's Feast lets you stack on top of that. And this laundry list of immunities solves a lot of problems for characters in the late game. Immunity to Frightened is more or less necessary for a bunch of late game encounters where enemies have passive ways or active ways to inflict you with devastating fear effects that can just lose you the encounter immediately. And making all your wisdom saves with advantage makes you much less likely to succumb to dangerous crowd control, which is often one of the only things that you're worried about in the end game when your characters have really good physical defenses, including damage resistances, and often very high armor class. Getting hit by a wisdom save debuff is one of the only things you're worried about in the end game, and Hero's Feast makes that vastly less likely. Immunity to disease and poison covers a surprising number of conditions that enemies inflict, so with Hero's Feast you'll be immune to those a lot of the time. And although it doesn't make you immune to poison damage, a lot of the effects that actually do poison damage do so by poisoning you, which Hero's Feast makes you immune to. So toxins and cloud kill and stuff like that inflict a poison type condition that damages you, which Hero's Feast does make you immune to. So a lot of the sources of poison damage in the game you'll get to ignore with Hero's Feast, and in fact you can stand in your own cloud kills and force enemies to fight in them where they're taking lots of damage and you're completely immune. All of these buffs together just make Hero's Feast a basically essential endgame spell. It just removes so much risk from your playthrough, and of course if you're using any summons then it multiplies its value immensely, but even without that, Hero's Feast buffing your party just lets you ignore so many effects that can otherwise be run killers just by virtue of having cast this spell. Doesn't take any actions in combat or anything, you just get the benefits as soon as you've cast it. Now, because it's a day-long, non-concentration buff, Hero's Feast is a spell that can be cast by a camp caster, so a lot of the time the advice you'll see is to use your camp caster's level 6 spell slot on Hero's Feast, and then remove them from your active party and go adventuring with the other party members. But even if you're using your active party members to cast this is just an amazing use of a 6th level spell slot. For a cleric or druid, Hero's Feast is usually going to be your first priority with your 6th level spells, because it's just that good. Even if you're spending spells from your active party to cast this, it's incredible. There is also one other thing that this spell does, which is it summons some camp supplies when you cast it, and it always summons more than 40 camp supplies. It's slightly random, as well as a bottle of water. So technically, if you have 2 characters casting Hero's Feast, you can long rest infinitely, because it'll refresh those spell slots, and even generate infinite gold, because you'll also get the bottle of water every time you do this. So you'll be eating all these camp supplies, refreshing the spell slots, and generating infinite bottles of water. If you have infinite time in real life, you can make infinite money. At that point, I highly suggest just cheating in the gold instead of spending that much time clicking, but technically, the existence of Hero's Feast gives you infinite gold as well. without that, even without that dumb little exploit, this spell is just ridiculous. It gives you so many immunities to so many dangerous things. S tier for Hero's Feast. Otiluke's Freezing Sphere. So this is a spell that is kind of weird. It has two modes, one of which is pretty straightforward, and one of which has a lot of subtlety to it. Firstly, this can just be a straight-up AoE damage spell. If cast in the launch mode, it has 60-foot range, 20-foot radius, and does 10d6 cold damage with a Constitution saving throw for half. 10d6 cold damage is an average of 35, and because it's cold damage, can be doubled with the wet condition, but in general, this is going to be a less efficient damage spell than Chain Lightning, unless you're hitting a lot of enemies in the 20-foot radius, because it just does less damage overall than Chain Lightning does. It also leaves behind an ice surface, which is extremely powerful, so there may be some cases where you want Freezing Sphere over Chain Lightning, but if you were just going to use this as a straight-up damage spell, the fact that it targets Con and that it does less damage than Chain Lightning is going to usually make it the less attractive option. The second way that you can use this spell is in the conveniently portable Freezing Sphere mode, where you essentially create this spell as a grenade that you can keep in your inventory and then throw anytime for the next 10 turns. If you don't use it for 10 turns, it will explode in your inventory and do a ton of damage to you, so you do want to throw this sphere away after casting it. This lets you precast it before combat, though you still have to use an attack to throw it, but because you are actually using the throw action instead of the cast action, if you give this to a character that has multiple attacks, because you can pass the grenade off between your character's inventories, then they can just use one attack on casting Freezing Sphere, which is a pretty powerful 6th level spell to get for only part of an action, and then still use the rest of their action to just make more weapon attacks or whatever. Now, if you do that, it will use the spell save DC of the character that throws it, not of the character that cast it. So you need a character that has high spell save DCs and multiple attacks in order to make the best use of this spell to make it action efficient. But if you pass it off to an ally who has both of those things, let's say they're a Sword Bard or Hexblade Warlock, or, as of patch 8, a Blade Singer Wizard who can use Freezing Sphere as a thrown weapon because they have multiple attacks and then still make other weapon attacks, which Blade Singer Wizards want to do, then this is actually a pretty efficient option. A spell that only takes part of your action is a lot more attractive than one that takes your full action, so even though it's slightly less efficient in terms of damage output to spell slot and everything, it's still a pretty good amount of damage, 10d6 cold if you double it with the wet condition, and because it's a thrown object, you can throw a water bottle with your first attack and follow up with a Freezing Sphere with your second attack as a very efficient use of your turn. This will do decent damage, provide a big ice surface, which is very powerful in Baldur's Gate. So if you have a character with the requirements to pass off a Freezing Sphere to them, or if you're playing a Blade Singer Wizard, then this can be a pretty cool option. Another thing that you can do with this item is to reverse pickpocket it into an enemy inventory. The Freezing Sphere explodes after 10 turns, so if you can put it in an enemy inventory without them noticing, then it will, just after 10 turns, blow up and do a bunch of cold damage to them and anyone that they're standing near, which can help be the best way to initiate a fight, or you can even kill enemies and get away completely without reprisal, because you can be up to 10 turns of movement away when this happens. So it has some really neat and intricate uses. Mostly, Freezing Sphere is going to be used to precast it before combat, pass it off to a hybrid character that has multiple attacks and high spell save DCs, and then have that character throw it. But there's also a couple other cool things that you can do, and even if you just straight up cast this spell as a nuke, it's not terrible. And Ice Surface is always going to make a spell somewhat attractive, so I'm going to give Freezing Sphere B tier. It just has a lot of interesting things that you can do with it, and a 6th level spell that only takes part of your action for a character is always going to be pretty powerful. Otto's Irresistible Dance. This is a single target control spell with 30-foot range, and enemies targeted by it have to dance. They get no saving throw, and they are forced to dance, taking no actions and being unable to move on their turn. At the end of each of their turns, they get a wisdom save to try to break out of the effect, so they're always going to lose at least one turn with no save when targeted by Irresistible Dance, and then in subsequent turns, if they fail the saving throws, they may continue to lose additional actions. Actually, technically, the save is made at the beginning of their turn, and then even if they succeed, they still skip their turn, same as Hold Person and Hold Monster for some reason. I don't know why they coded it that way, but it's the same effect as if they made the save at the end of their turn. No save crowd control is obviously incredibly powerful. A lot of boss fights, there's just one tough enemy that you want to get out of the way, and being able to remove them without a saving throw is awesome. Especially because of the way that Baldur's Gate implemented legendary resistance, where enemies just get a +10 bonus to a saving throw. Otto's Irresistible Dance totally bypasses legendary resistance, so they just get no chance to succeed against this. Like some other forms of crowd control, Otto's is also not enemies who are immune to a lot of other forms of disable are not immune to Otto's Irresistible Dance. So even against some enemies who are immune to a lot of other forms of crowd control, you can still hit them with this spell and they don't get to save against it. Obviously, this is for specific fights, and boss fights in particular, where there's one really tough enemy that you want to take out of the fight. But if that is a fight that you are in, and that describes a lot of fights in Baldur's Gate 3, Otto's is the best tool for just making sure that that enemy doesn't take their next turn, and probably continues to not take turns for the rest of the combat. There's also some pretty nice synergies with this spell. It's an enchantment spell, so you can bonus action cast it with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, and enchantment wizards can cast it on 2 targets when they get their double casting capstone, which is incredibly powerful. If you can double up on Otto's Irresistible Dance, then it's really quite busted. So there's definitely some synergies with this spell, but just by default, in any boss fight, casting autos in order to force them to skip at least one and possibly more turns is going to be great. No save crowd control is always excellent. You won't use this in fights where there isn't just like one main enemy that you need to get rid of, so I'm going to give it A tier because it doesn't go in every fight, but in the fights where this spell is good, it's incredible. Planar Ally. Planar Ally is a cleric summon spell, and like the other level 6 summon spells, this one gives you an extremely capable additional fighter for your party that can last all day, and make your entire party significantly stronger for multiple encounters as long as you keep it alive, by tanking, dealing damage, and distracting enemies. The Planar Ally has 3 forms, so you can summon 3 different creatures with it, depending on what you want. The first option is the Genie, which gives you a 161 hit point, 19 armor class character, with solid melee damage and a bunch of crowd control spells, as well as at-will Misty Step. So this makes a pretty good crowd controlling tank. You can put it anywhere on the battlefield that you want, because it can bonus action teleport. Got 160 hit points, so it will survive most rounds of combat from enemies, and 19 armor class is not great, but not too embarrassing at this level, so sometimes enemies will miss attacking it, and then it has a bunch of crowd control abilities to be disruptive, and okay melee damage to fall back on. The Deva is the second option, and this gives you a 136 hit points, so slightly fewer hit points, but 21 AC, so about as tanky as the Genie, a little better against physical damage, a little worse against spells. That doesn't have much utility to speak of, but is flying and does excellent melee damage. So you can use this if you want a damage dealing tank, and it will be pretty good. 21 AC, even this late in the game, is totally respectable. Enemies will still miss 21 AC enough, and it's still low enough that you can easily get your party to have higher AC to cause enemies to concentrate attacks on your summon, which of course is what you're going to want. Finally, you can summon the Cambion, which has 82 hit points and 14 armor class, so it will get hit by pretty much anything that attacks, and does very weak melee damage, but has a not bad ranged attack, but with very low chance to hit. So the upshot is that when you're using Planar Ally, if you want a crowd control tank, you should summon the Genie. If you want a damage tank, you should summon the Deva, and if you want to regret your life choices, you should summon the Cambion. Planar Ally is very powerful. 160 hit points is as many hit points as a party member will have at this point, so you get just a whole extra party member's worth of HP, which you can then buff further with Aid and Hero's Feast. These creatures can be healed because they're not undead, so you can use them for all day pretty easily, and they do decent damage in the case of the Deva, or decent crowd control in the case of the Genie, and will absorb a lot of attacks. They're very mobile in battle, so you have a lot of control over what you're doing with them. Just an extremely powerful tool. Overall, I would say they're quite a bit worse than the Myrmidons from Conjure Elemental, which is the secret 6th level summon spell. But clerics don't get Conjure Elemental, so you're not really comparing them directly to the Conjure Elemental Myrmidons. You're comparing them to casts of things like Hero's Feast or Blade Barrier, and in that case, the Planar Ally makes an amazing option. If my general rule is you should prioritize having Hero's Feast up on your party with your first 6th level spell slot, whether that be from a cleric or druid or campcaster. But after you have Hero's Feast, Planar Ally is by far the next best thing to cast this on, way better than any other 6th level options available to clerics. So I'm going to give it A tier because I do think you should prioritize Hero's Feast over it. But the Planar Ally is still an amazing ally and a great summon that will empower your party significantly. So if you have a spell slot to spend on this, you should summon a Genie or a Deva, and you will certainly not regret doing so. Next up, Sunbeam. Sunbeam is a repeatable damage spell similar to Call Lightning, which does 6d8 radiant damage for an average of 27 damage in a 60-foot line that's 8 feet wide. So you can often hit 3 or 4 enemies if you position yourself appropriately and get pretty decent damage out of this spell. It has a Constitution save for half, and if enemies fail the con save, they're also blinded for 1 turn. You can recast it each turn for 10 turns, as long as you concentrate on it, and just like all of the other spells that you can recast every turn, if you're hasted, you can recast it multiple times per turn, which can let you get actually very good turn-over-turn AoE damage out of Sunbeam. Sunbeam is kind of funny. You might expect it to be a cleric spell, but it's a druid, sorcerer, wizard spell. And because it's radiant damage, if it was a cleric spell, it would actually have more synergy, because often the Radiating Orb item set is going to be on your cleric, and applying AoE radiant damage with that item set is super powerful. But if you have a character that's using Sunbeam, then you can just have them wear the Radiating Orbs, and so radiant damage can still be very relevant to other characters. This spell is pretty inefficient if you're just using it for straight up damage. 27 AoE damage, but obviously can be a little more, can be a little less, and often will be a lot less because it's a con save, so enemies will make the save pretty reliably. Is not that exciting, but if you're playing a hasted character or you're using Radiating Orbs, then Sunbeam can be significantly better, because you can double up on the damage and you can use it to apply a bunch of debuffs. You'll notice that I haven't really mentioned the blind that this applies, and there's a reason for that. Blind is a pretty solid debuff, but the blind applied by Sunbeam only lasts for 1 turn. And in Baldur's Gate 3, because the timing rules in this game are extremely inconsistent and frankly not super well implemented, blinds lose duration at the beginning of the enemy turn. So a 1-turn blind will never actually blind an enemy, because when their turn starts, the duration of the blind goes away and they lose the blind effect. So Sunbeam unfortunately doesn't apply blind in practice, except on your turn. So you can use it to get advantage on attacks with subsequent attacks from your allies, but you can't use it to actually blind your enemies in terms of applying crowd control. This spell has a lot of caveats. You really just need to be hasted, you need to be using Radiating Orbs, and then you can get really good value out of it. And most of the time, the best way to use this is, of course, with the Blood of Lathander or with Scrolls, rather than actually casting your 6th level spell slot, because it's competing as a sorcerer wizard spell with some incredibly powerful spells. Conjure Elemental, Globe of Invulnerability, Chain Lightning, Wall of Ice, etc. are all going to usually be better casts than Sunbeam. And as a druid spell, similarly, there's really good alternatives to this. So Sunbeam is often going to be the weakest option in terms of a damage spell, but if you build around it and set up your party to use it, it can be pretty good. I'm going to give it B tier because it's very playable once you have structured your party to make use of it. But if you haven't, you probably won't want to use Sunbeam. Next up, Wall of Ice. Wall of Ice is a spell that's changed a lot of times throughout the lifetime of Baldur's Gate 3, and it received some pretty significant buffs, so this is a spell you may not have previously paid attention to, but it's very much worth taking a look at this spell. Wall of Ice creates a wall in the same casting mode as Wall of Fire, where you draw a line between 2 points. Each endpoint has to be within 60 feet of the caster, so the maximum distance that you can get with Wall of Ice is 120 feet. Though, obviously, usually you're going to get less than that, and it will often be interrupted by terrain along the way, so depending on the arena, you may not get the full length casting of Wall of Ice. When you cast it on an enemy, or near an enemy, because it has a fairly large width as well as a long length, enemies nearby it take 10d6 cold damage with a dexterity saving throw for half, and it also creates an ice surface next to the length of the wall, where enemies, of course, have to make a dex save or fall prone. In addition to that, it summons a wall that's basically the same as a wall of stone with a bunch of pillars with 30 HP each, making up the length of the wall. But unlike Wall of Stone, when each of these pillars breaks, they leave behind a cloud of cold damage, a cold damage cloud, which does 10d6 additional cold damage to everything caught inside of it, with a constitution save for half. This is very powerful because there are two ways that this spell can, that the damage can show up from the second half of this spell, because there's two ways that these pillars can be broken. Either you or enemies can deal damage to them, or you can simply drop concentration on the spell. 10d6 cold damage plus a dexterity save or become prone on the initial cast on a pretty big AoE spell is already not completely embarrassing for a 6th level spell. Just like Freezing Sphere, that's a reasonable use of your action, not the most exciting, but pretty good. But if you cast Wall of Ice and then cancel it immediately, canceling concentration, enemies take the initial 10d6 cold damage, dex save for half, then they're caught in the cloud because you just canceled the Wall of Ice pillars on top of them, so they're inside the cloud of ice, and they take another 10d6 cold damage, and then at the start of their turn, they're still inside of this cloud, so they take a third 10d6 cold damage. Each of these instances of damage, of course, is cold damage, so can be doubled with the wet condition, which means that enemies take a truly absurd amount of damage before their next turn comes around. It's a gigantic AoE nuke in the cast and cancel mode, and of course you can also use it the way the spell is more intended to be used, where it's a big nuke that knocks enemies prone and then also provides a wall, but the ability to cast and then immediately cancel this makes this, in theory, the highest damaging spell in the game. That, in theory, is kind of important, though, because there are two things that hold this back from just being an absurdly powerful nuclear bomb of a spell. One, it's very fiddly to actually get the triple damage on enemies. The positioning needs to be pretty precise for them to both be able, for a pillar to be able to spawn next to them so that when you break it, the cloud appears, but for them to be close enough to actually be in the cloud after it appears. A lot of the time, if you put it right over top of an enemy, the pillar just won't spawn, and so you'll never get the cloud damage. Or the enemy, if you don't put it right over top of them, the enemy will be too far away and outside of the secondary damaging effect of this spell. So the positioning can be pretty difficult on top of the already tricky wall casting interface. And then secondly, just like some of the other wall spells, the save DCs are bugged at time of recording. The initial damage is a fixed DC 15 dexterity save, which enemies will make extremely reliably, taking half damage, and the subsequent damage is a fixed DC 16 con save, which enemies again will make very reliably, taking half damage. So between the bugs and the fiddly casting, this spell isn't just truly absurd. If those were fixed, I would put it in S tier, but even given those bugs and how it can be tricky to use, this is still just a ridiculous amount of damage for a single spell cast, alongside the utility of knocking everything over. It's got a huge AoE, so you can hit entire encounters with it. So I'm going to give it A tier. If the bugs were fixed, I would bump it up to S tier. Next up, Wall of Thorns. Wall of Thorns is a 6th level druid spell that essentially combines 3 lower level druid spells into a single spellcast. You can kind of think of this as giving you Wall of Fire, Plant Growth, and Entangle all with a single cast of a spell. And those are all pretty solid spells, so even at the cost of a higher level spell slot, getting them all at once can be pretty powerful. It's a wall spell, so it comes with the same casting interface and the same advantages and issues that presents in Baldur's Gate 3 as the other wall spells. And when inside of it, enemies take 7d8 piercing damage, which is an average of 31.5 damage, or I think 1.5 less than Blade Barrier, so pretty good damage output. And just like Blade Barrier, it double dips, so enemies take the damage both when they first enter it, and then also at the beginning of their turn. It being piercing damage is also relevant because it synergizes with the Bloodthirst dagger or the Ballast Armor in order to double the damage. That by itself is obviously not very exciting. We didn't rate Blade Barrier very high because that damage output is not amazing, but in addition to that, it also quarters enemy movement speed and has a chance of entangling. Enemies get a dex save for half against the damage, and a strength save or become entangled and immobilized, which can keep them trapped inside the Wall of Thorns. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, the spell is absurdly buggy, just like a lot of the other wall spells. In this case, the dexterity save against the damage is set at a fixed DC of 3. So just like Blade Barrier, enemies will almost always take half damage from this spell. And the strength save against the entangle effect is a fixed DC of 12. So all but the weakest enemies will trivially pass that, and enemies will very rarely become entangled by Wall of Thorns. In addition to that, although the tooltip says that it quarters enemy movement speed, they just used the wrong type of difficult terrain. They didn't use the plant growth tag, they just used the normal difficult terrain tag, so it only actually reduces enemy movement speed by half. So the tooltip there is just false. Unfortunately, all of those bugs together, which, of course, by the time you're watching this, may be fixed if you're watching this well after recording, but I wouldn't hold my breath because these are very old bugs. All these bugs together really hold this spell back. What should be a spell that just wins encounters very quickly, unfortunately just doesn't work. Enemies take way less damage than they should because they always pass the save against the damage. Enemies don't get entangled, and they don't get trapped inside of it because they move at half speed instead of 1/4 speed. If they were moving at 1/4 speed with the chance of getting entangled, it would be very hard for enemies to get out of the Wall of Thorns, but as is, they can usually just walk out of it because the effects of the spell simply don't function. Even with all those bugs, all of these effects together are still pretty good. If any of the entangles goes off, then this spell is pretty solid, and it combines extremely well with other sources of AoE damage, things like Hunger of Hadar, etc., and Darkness to keep enemies inside of it to deal consistent damage. So even though it is bugged, unlike Blade Barrier, those bugs don't completely remove its utility because it still has the possibility of locking an enemy inside of it and then dealing consistent damage over time. It's piercing damage, so even when they're taking half damage, maybe you're doubling that if you're using one of the effects that does so. So Wall of Thorns still definitely has its place. I'm going to give it B tier because I think it is still good enough, even with all of those bugs, that it can sometimes be worth casting. Though as a druid spell, it's usually going to be outcompeted by other possible druid spells, in particular Hero's Feast. But Wall of Thorns definitely still does have its place. I could see dropping it down to C tier if those bugs really bother you, and if you're not building around it with piercing damage vulnerabilities, and so on. And if the bugs were fixed, I would bring it up to A tier as an encounter winning spell, but as is, given those bugs, B tier seems fair for this spell. It's kind of unfortunate that so many of these 6th level spells are so buggy, but that's the unfortunate reality. Windwalk. Windwalk lets you turn your entire party into gaseous form. So it lets you cast the level 3 spell Gaseous Form on your whole party, giving them flying movement, making them incorporeal, giving them resistance to damage, and becoming tiny so they can squeeze through cracks in the walls and stuff. There's obviously some potential for out-of-combat exploration and traversal with Windwalk, and you can do some of the tricks that you can do with Gaseous Form with Windwalk using your whole party, but mostly this is just spending a 6th level spell slot for the benefits of a 3rd level spell that's already pretty marginal at 3rd level, so you just shouldn't cast Windwalk. This spell just duplicates a weak effect for a much, much more expensive resource, D tier. And finally, the third of the 3 secret spells available in Baldur's Gate 3. So again, this is only available to a wizard who finds a scroll of this spell at a certain story point and can scribe it into their spell list. Sights of the Seelie summon Deva. This is identical to using Planar Ally to summon a Deva, except it can only do that, so you can't summon the Genie or the Cambion. And it's a wizard spell instead of a cleric spell, which does mean it's competing against more powerful summons for use of your spell slot. Wizard spell slots, especially 6th level spells, are just more contested, because you have Conjure Elemental available, which is going to be better than the Deva. The Myrmidons are typically more powerful, and Globe of Invulnerability and things like Chain Lightning and Wall of Ice also competing for those spell slots. So Sights of the Seelie is less exciting for a wizard than it is for a cleric. The Deva's still a very good summon, and if you have ways to refresh your 6th level spell slots and get both, then you can definitely use this, but I would summon the Myrmidon first, save my spell slots for Globe of Invulnerability second, and summon Sights of the Seelie only third, and that's if I didn't want Chain Lightning or Wall of Ice for a given encounter in order to blow up the encounter. So a lot of wizard characters won't actually end up using this spell. This spell is, makes me kind of sad because this used to be a 5th level spell. So you would get the Deva summon as a 5th level wizard spell, which was really cool, a more restricted but lower level version of a powerful 6th level summon. I thought was a really cool thing for a wizard to have access to. And they nerfed it in patch, I want to say 6, to being a 6th level spell, which means it's just dramatically less interesting. It's not even really about the power level, but just a more restricted version of a spell that clerics get. Kind of neat that wizards get access to that as a secret spell, but not that exciting from the standpoint of actually casting it. The summon is still very good, but it is just going to be outcompeted by a lot of other wizard options, so I'm going to give Sights of the Seelie Summon Deva B tier, because you can still definitely use this if you have lots of ways to refresh your spell slots. It's just going to be a lower priority than other things that wizards can be doing with their level 6 spells. Alright, my friends, that is the 6th level spells, and with that, we have covered every single spell available to player characters in Baldur's Gate 3 over nearly 10 hours of video. So if you've been watching since the beginning of this tier list, thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed it and got some interesting and useful information that will help you build your characters and select spells and understand the most rewarding, but also most complex mechanic in the game. Looking at the 6th level spells, it's not surprising to me that they cluster around the middle a little bit more and that a lot of them are in B tier or lower. Remember, all of these spells are competing against every other spell in the game for use of this spell slot. So the fact that there's still some in the really high tiers is honestly a testament to just how powerful these spells are. Mostly you're going to be using these for massive all-day benefits like Hero's Feast or Planar Ally or the hidden 6th level spell Conjure Elementals. But also you can use spells like Globe of Invulnerability, Chain Lightning, Ottos, and Wall of Ice to just win certain encounters in a single blow, which saves you a lot of resources spent on that encounter if you were going to try to do it with lower level spell slots. Either way, these are really powerful options and a fitting capstone, I think, to the earth-shaking power of your spellcasting characters. As always, of course, if you think that there are spells that I have misplaced here, especially ones that I have underrated, I'm very interested in hearing your opinions on that. Looking at this tier list, I think the 6th level spells is the one that I changed the least from my earlier version of this tier list a year ago, though there has still definitely been some movement. And of course, I'm very open to moving things around if you have good arguments or use cases that I might not have considered for any of these spells. And of course, if you have enjoyed the video generally, leave a comment and hit the like button. Helps me out with the algorithm. You can hype the video, I think. YouTube has introduced that. I still don't know what it does, but, push those buttons. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 tier lists. I will be back with a sort of overall summary of these spell tier lists at some point, though I may take a little break before doing that. And of course, more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Also, of course, if you're feeling extremely generous, and if it's not a hardship, then financial support is always appreciated, and you can do that by leaving a super thanks, or by becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. I try not to harass people about that too often, but I figure if you've made it 10 hours into the spell tier list, then maybe you don't mind hearing about that as well. Alright, my friends, thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.